Hi, my name is Tim Rush, and I am here with,
Jason Thornton.
we're the preaching ministers at Memorial Drive Church of Christ in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And this is our post sermon conversation. This is something that representative of the conversations we have in our office on a weekly basis, sometimes post, sometimes pre, usually both. Um, and we don't get to be in the office as much, though. Jason is in the office today.
Yeah, this is what it looks like in all its glory.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
I'm coming to you live from St. Louis.
nice.
But that's not true, but I've been saving the screensaver for when they say baseball season is coming. And they said last night, maybe it's coming. So,
I am an anti-baseball person, but I'm a very pro-Rush person. So I've been in the baseball world for 17 years now, and
yep, yep.
or the Rush world. So anyway, so I am so excited for your excitement.
Right, right,
60 big games coming up, hopefully,
right.
or whatever. So, hey, so on Sunday, you took the sermon, and our overall theme comes out of Ephesians 2, which I thought you've done a great job, by the way, of really contextualizing well your last two sermons, of putting us right back in the framing. And then the first lesson where I preached, I was talking about just setting it up. What do we mean by "but God who is rich in mercy," and how is that the turning point nature of it? And you took us to the dynamic last week of pain. That one of the reasons why we really need to internalize the "but God who is rich in mercy" is because when you're hurting, that consumes everything, and you're going to
Yeah,
say things like Psalm 77, you know.
yeah,
And then Sunday you talked about the dynamic of waiting. That's the other thing that comes up. Okay, if God is so great, why is it not happening right now?
yeah.
And you use the life of Joseph to center that. And so I just think it's really, really good. I want to cut back a bit and say, what resonates with you about the dynamic of God being rich in mercy and speaking to those different parts of ourselves? Why is that significant to you? Because you emphasize it a lot more than I did on my first sermon about the idea of being rich in mercy.
Yeah, I feel like whenever we first started talking about but God, my thought was his power and his, the great stories that I feel like they're really important. The Rich Mullins song, stories like that make a boy grow bold. Stories like that make a man walk straight. So I feel like it's really important to remember God's power and that uh, to remain faithful because he will show up. But then when Shane, just in one of our conversations, when he mentioned but God who is rich in mercy, it reframed the stories for me. That it wasn't just about God showing off, but there was a merciful heart behind it. So it took it from superhero into a very caring move.
Yeah, absolutely. That does make sense. I'll tell you, if you're facing a problem, what you think you need most is the power to do it your way.
Mm-hmm.
I don't. I assume all humanity works that way, or we feel a loss when we can't work that
Mm-hmm.
to make stop or make it work or make it right. And it's interesting, and I think it is very telling. God makes odd. This is an odd appeal in some ways because now he's just talked about, and you made this point on Sunday, he's just talked about you were by nature objects of wrath. And we could dive deep into what does that mean? But clearly that's negative. You know what I mean? You deserve nothing is what he's saying. And God's going to change the whole course of your history, but not based on his power. He'll use his power based on his mercy. And that's like if I come to you and I say, Tim, I know I hurt your feelings. And your immediate response to me, starting with your nonverbal, is very merciful. You have kind eyes. your first words speak to the hurt that I'm experiencing, and you're gracious about being grateful for my apology, even if my apology is not said just right or whatever, my whole experience with you changes. I want to be more humble. I want to be more aware of things that hurt you and steer away from those. And
Yeah.
then to understand that your mercy, and that you're a merciful man. And that is a signal,
Hey, my computer glitched at "you're a merciful man."
Yeah, well, that's all you needed to know, Tim. You are a
Okay.
merciful man. No, but even though you're a merciful man, well, this is about, but the dynamic is how much more God is merciful. Like
Yeah.
your mercy
Yeah.
pales in comparison. So that's hard for us to internalize, especially if we're raised in a legalistic, you're only as good as your last performance religion.
Yeah.
Is that to think about God as more merciful than any human being I've ever interacted with. If maybe your grandma was merciful, or your mom, or some person that you knew, it usually don't associate with men, but if a man was very merciful with you, you just think that's a pinnacle. And you realize, wait, compared to God's mercy, this person.
Yeah.
So good.
Well, we take the Old Testament heroes, and they're heroes, and so there's, well, of course God is going to lead Joshua and David because look how great they are. And so this recontexts it into, it's not because they were the strongest or they were the bravest. It was because of God's mercy. God's mercy is what mattered in the story, not the man or the woman who the story seems like it's about.
That's a great point. The Bible is not about David or Deborah or Moses or Peter.
Mm-hmm.
The Bible is all about God.
Yeah. Man, my internet is really glitchy right now. It's really pausing in and out. So my apologies to anybody that's trying to stay with this.
Yeah.
One of the things that I remember being at a youth rally when I was in probably junior high, and the speaker was talking about sexual immorality. And he was saying to us, it was fascinating because he wasn't telling us what the lines of sexual immorality are, which looking back, I'm like, man, he was ahead of his time to not give us a list. Don't touch this. Don't do that. And he was saying, you need to decide what is too far, and make a commitment to yourself. How far will you go? How far will you not go? And you need to make that decision now. Because if you wait until you're in the back seat of the car, you've waited too long to make that decision. You need to know ahead of time what will your limits be. Did I glitch there? And I feel this is an odd parallel, but I feel like that's why these stories are important. We need to decide now, will we trust God in hard times? We need to prepare ourselves. The wise man building his house on the rock doesn't say, and if you build on foundation, the storm won't come. It's clear the storm will come. Where is your foundation at? And we have that tendency to believe, well, if I build a strong foundation of faith and belief in God, then I'll avoid the storm. And that's not what the Bible says. So we need to make these stories a huge part of our life, deciding I want to be like Joseph. I want to be like David. I want to be a man who will continue to follow God, continue to trust God, even when it's years in prison and even when it's years in slavery. Because, man, when the storm hits, then it is so hard then to find a God that you've not been leaning on previously.
Right. That's Super. That is so true. So I want to go back to a previous point you made, how, you and I did a sermon series 2 years ago or whenever called This Is Us. And we just stayed in the Old Testament. We took person after person after person and talked about the mess their life was. Mm. And we got pushback from members of the congregation. Like I had a person come to me one time because I had talked about the redemption of a person. You're finally talking about redemption. Like, it was so uncomfortable for so many in our church to point out these negative things. And what was funny about it is, I'm like, Tim and I aren't making this up. We're not speculating. This is what God chose to give us, these negative stories about these people. And see, I think that discomfort comes from, we think mature Christians are clean. Mm-hmm. We think mature Christians are perfect. And the rub with that is we never think we're mature, because we just have to keep being clean. But basically, that's a works-based mentality. And when you start to entertain the idea, did God choose these people because they were moral? There were some of them that seemed moral on their own, but I think he chose them specifically because they were a mess. I can't say enough. I would not trust David around my family. And he was a man after God's own heart, but he was a mess. And we don't even dig into most of the time the text where we always talk about David and Bathsheba as if that was one moment, of just bad choice. But he has a whole history of bad choices, of not seeking God, of doing things that are so cruel. I mean, so unnecessarily cruel. And the message from David's life is God still worked with him, through him, because he wanted God, as feeble and as weak as he was.
Yeah.
I mean, there is not a father I know that is a worse father than David. And I know some fathers have made some huge mistakes, not worse than David. I mean, just terrible parenting. There's not a better example of terrible parenting. Maybe Jacob, getting back to the story this week. But anyway, but the point there is, God chose weak people, flawed people that didn't necessarily get better with time, to show his power and his mercy. So back to our point, that's why this is so important for us to internalize.
Yeah, I wonder if there's some modicum of control that we think we know we aren't the perfect person, but we think if we get there, then everything will go well. And so even that is admitting we don't have control, but it's that carrot just dangling out in front of us of getting there. And so to point out Jonah, Samson, to point out their shortcomings, it feels threatening because it takes away the carrot of, but I thought, I've said this before, when I went off to AIM, when I left home at 17, I thought my dad was the mature, ultimate Christian. And he didn't have any struggles. He didn't have any problems, everything, so I thought, when I'm that age, then I will be the mature, non-struggling Christian. When I left home at 17, my dad, I think he was 42. I passed that by. I've blown by 42 and have not become that non-struggling Christian. And it does feel like, oh man, but one day, and I think when we demythicize, if that's a word, the Old Testament heroes particularly, it's a recognition of, we are them and they are us, and there's no control. God has control, and so that's where my faith needs to be.
That's right. Yeah, and that's the thing. That is the theme of the Bible. Is he's got this, you don't, will you own it and accept him, on his terms, not your own. And moral behavior comes when you've done that internalization. You do become typically more kind. If you're really trusting him, you will have more of the fruit of the Spirit. Let's talk in that terms. That's a more biblically accurate way of thinking about it. But your fruit of the Spirit isn't the signal, or isn't the reason that God keeps saving you. Oh, you're showing love. Well, you can be in it for today. It's all cart before the horse. It's all backwards. And so trying to reclaim that. The other thing I would say is, having worked with Terry more as a peer, and I know you have too, in your life, I can tell you some of his weaknesses now. And he had those at 42, and he had
Right.
them at, when I started working with him, because he's human. The big difference for his era, and I think this is true of many people in this era, is they were ordered, don't show it.
Mm.
I feel great sympathy for doctors who are Christians, for Christians who are doctors, because as a doctor, you have to come into the room and you have to be right. You have to be calm. Like, nobody wants a doctor to come into the room and say, I don't know. You know what I mean? And so they've got to, I want them to lie to me if they don't know, and then go
Right.
study. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so that pressure that's put on doctors when they move out of their doctor role to then try to be honest in real life, that's just hard. I have great respect for Christian doctors who are able to transition and then be honest.
Yeah.
And I think that's the kind of pressure that were put on men and women 20, 30, 40 years ago of, it's not a matter of will you be authentic, it's that it's completely not honoring God to be honest about your struggles. It's you're representing God poorly.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a message that is dwindling. So it's much easier for me to be authentic now because I'm not under that pressure.
Right.
Go ahead.
Well, I remember going to another church, and the preacher was really, he was good, but there was something about him that he just did not connect with his audience. And he was very meticulous. He was very well prepared. He was a good communicator, knowledgeable of scripture, applied it well. But there was something about it that I was like, man, that I couldn't put my finger on it. And then after months, he made a mistake, and he made fun of himself, and the whole audience laughed, and he went on. And I thought, oh, that was it. He has never been normal. Like he's never been authentic until that moment of a mistake that he didn't pretend like he didn't make it. He laughed it off, and he handled it perfectly. But it was the first time it felt like the audience connected with him, and it was this weird dynamic.
Yeah. And you probably taught me this, but I respect your strength. I respect your accomplishment, but I don't move closer to you. Matter of fact, the tendency is, knowing my own weaknesses, I will elevate you. And the irony is, your message will become less and less applicable.
Mm-hmm.
Even your dad, I remember, and it's probably been 12, 13 years ago, he really decided to start sharing his mistakes. He made an intentional decision to start sharing his mistakes with the church, because when you would talk to people and say, hey, what have you learned being at Memorial? How's it changed you in the way you interact with people? They would say, well, about the same, basically. And then you'd say, well, what about what Terry's saying? And they would always say, but that's Terry.
Yeah.
And realizing that, he started to admit his mistakes. And I think he made deeper and deeper connection with the people. I respect your strength, but I connect with your weakness.
Yeah.
Shared pain connects us.
So this is moving more into preaching than this lesson, but when I was in Amherst, so this is early 2000s, before we went to Mexico, at one point I started asking different men in the congregation, would they offer the invitation? And to do that, like, I would preach, and then they step up prepared to say, like, I'd give them a thumbnail version of what I was going to preach, but would they say, this is how that fits my life, this is why it's important in my life, and then offer the invitation. And the people would respond so differently and my story is to the guy that's not the preacher, because he's not paid to stand there, and there's just a different there is something different about one of us. And I'm saying congregationally, that looking at the one of us is up there saying, this really matters in my life. It's such a fascinating complexity of we're the ones that are supposed to be communicating and ministering, but then because of our actual role, it separates us. Uh, it puts I don't know, emotional distance or between us and those who are listening.
Right. Yeah, the other factor that is a cultural factor and it affects the church is what I call death of the expert.
Mm.
That, and always relate it to, if I moved to a new town, well, 30 years ago, I would move to a new town, and whatever the corollary to Google was, I'd call the local hospital or whatever, who's a good doctor, and I'd ask a doctor about a good doctor. But now we crowdsource. I
Mm-hmm.
reach out to non-doctors. Like I'm even suspicious of doctors. I want to hear from non-doctors, because I think 1,000 people that don't understand medicine will be a better source than one guy that understands medicine. Like, they'll
Yeah.
give me a better, more honest perception because of our distrust of institution, culturally speaking. And I think it's true for the ministers. I mean, there was a time when a minister would say something and it'd be like, I mean, the minister said that. And I'm not suggesting no one thinks that way anymore, but the
Mm.
majority do not in our culture. And so that's that dynamic you speak of. I think that feeds into it. It's like, oh, if this guy is saying it, he's more like me, and so it's going to have more bearing,
Yeah.
or I
Yeah.
listen differently at the very least.
He understands where I'm coming from.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So talk to me. Part of there was a piece of this story that you devoted to fathers, but you started with the dynamic of the weirdness of the family structures,
Mm-hmm.
and what we perceive as, well, yeah. He had, I like to say, he had 4 women who were doing competitive reproduction,
Yeah.
and that's fine. I mean, that's totally fine, where if you saw that in today's, if somebody came in and, shared that story, their testimony, I have my 4 wives here. Number one, there'd be some kind of legal action, and probably some abuse of power. We
Mm-hmm.
would immediately assume that. But we certainly wouldn't say, oh yeah, that's fine. And what do you make of that, God including these stories with, these kind of dynamics at play?
Yeah. It that says to me we don't understand the culture they were living in.
Mm.
That was that was probably living better than the culture that they were in. And we just can't imagine. I was sitting in a class when a teacher said, hey, what do you make of this verse that says women are the weaker, does it say weaker sex? I can't remember how it's.
Or vessel, maybe?
Yeah.
That's what the big translation.
And so the class goes on and on about, well, it could mean this, it could mean that. And the teacher said, after quite a while, I was like, anybody ever think maybe they're weaker? Physically they're weaker. And it was just like, we didn't even think about that. And there was it wasn't Conan the Barbarian, but there was some movie out at the time that it my head like dinged on that movie, where if the men were gone, women were in danger, like from raiders and
Right.
people coming in and taking them into slavery. And I thought, we don't live in a culture where it is distinguishingly important to be stronger. And,
Right.
and this is a whole rabbit hole, but between Kim and I, Kim is a much better athlete. She's faster. She's more agile. We do exercises that involve running or jumping or whatever, and she can just keep going. So I have this image of her, but then what's true is if we race, I'm way faster. I mean, it's not a close competition. And I just say that to say, and if we're doing weights, we're not in the same ballpark. So there is something that I mean, that's just true, but it doesn't matter in our world. um, did I glitch out there? It's true. There's differences, but it doesn't matter today. Where in their culture, man, it made a difference if the men were around or not.
Right.
Uh, yeah, that's a crazy rabbit trail, but just think there's
No,
things that we
that's a
don't.
good reminder. Yeah, that is a good reminder. My head always goes to what I referenced earlier. There's a really strong message to me is we assume that a holy God would come in and demand holiness from the people he's working with. It's clear from both Genesis and from Jesus' statement that God's intention is one man and one woman, married for a lifetime. That's patently, clear. Patently is not the right word there, but that's clear. And yet God puts up with, all these things. I remember there was I don't know what you call it, just a picture, and it says the marriage God permits. And it was around the time where they were really debating same-sex marriage and saying there's only one way that marriage could happen. And so these were not fans of the Bible, or maybe they were fans of the Bible, but not fans of Christianity, popular Christianity. And it had, like man with his slave, man with one woman, all these different dynamics, like 9 different. And the guy that posted, I wrote him, and on Facebook, I just made a comment, and I said, man, thank you so much to remind me that we don't have to get it culturally right to be right with God. We don't have to, the world does, I think we think, being raised in America and the idea of a Christian nation, this kind of thing, that if there's evil going on, then God is somehow hands tied. If we don't, I was raised, if we don't have prayer, allow abortion, that's going to limit God's power. And don't get me wrong. I mean, I think it'd be great. Well, you can pray in the school anytime. You just do this. And you just prayed in the school. You know what I mean? But I understand what they're saying. And the idea, obviously, I'm pro-life and that kind of thing. But it's just this idea of thinking, unless you get to a certain place, then God can't really work through you. And that is this story, and these stories scream that's not true. Mm-hmm. It's about your heart wanting to be led. And the difference is, in the Old Testament, God would pick one person and one person and one person, typically. And now God, through his Spirit, works through everyone that's willing to be worked through,
Yeah, this reminds me of your Facebook Live last week when you talked about what God does over a span of 200 years versus this weekend. But the idea of him calling us to holiness, and that's true, but he doesn't put the same restrictive nature on it that we do. Right. Like when you think of David and his failings as a dad, but when you put it into the culture, and that how did you say, reproductive competition, to have how many homes or separations in the palace, I don't know how it worked, but how many wives and concubines did he have that were raising his children, that it takes it out of the possibility of a father having dinner with his family. Like that's no longer a part of the possibility, that he wouldn't be able to give face to face, and that you can't, it's not about quantity, it's about quality, but you can't have quality unless you have quantity.
Right.
So he is doing what he can do by taking in all these women, and it's creating a system to where it's removing him from the lives of his children, and that isn't what God wants. But God doesn't say, so you're out. God just slowly moves to change us so that we are moving towards, and I don't think it's holiness because he doesn't want us to have fun. He wants children to have good homes. And so
Right.
he moves over centuries to bring in the secular family as the system, and that doesn't say. And so if you're a single mom, tough, there's no redemption, because he still works and he still moves. But I think it's not wrong to say, I think he loves our kids, and he wants his kids to have loving mothers. He
Yeah.
wants his kids to have loving fathers.
Right. So let's talk about Jacob comes to us, and I understand it's a different culture, but Jacob comes to us and he says to us, I accidentally married Leah. And her dad has offered that if I work 7 more years, I can be married to both Leah and Rachel. And we would have said that's immoral. No. Okay. And then, so let's say Jacob listens to us and he doesn't have Joseph and they all die in a famine. Okay. Now that's human thinking, of course, because God would work to save his people. My point in that is not to say that marrying 2 women is a good idea or pleases God. It doesn't. It's very clear. It's just to say we have to be super careful to say God won't work through this.
Mhm.
Because honestly, if you are willing to put in the time in the Old Testament, most of the time you're like, accept this.
Yeah.
And accept this. And it's not that God creates situations. God didn't create Laban's lie, to get, Leah into Jacob before Rachel. He'll work through anything. That's the message to me. He'll work through
Yeah.
anything.
Yeah. I struggle with as a preacher. Do I communicate God sent Joseph to prison, or that God worked through that? Because I don't. I feel like it's horrible things happen to people, and I don't want to say God did that, but I
Right.
don't know. Did God do that?
Yeah.
Or did God use that? And I feel really confident in being able to say whatever it is, God can use it.
Yeah.
I honestly, I don't know if this makes me a bad theologian, but I don't feel like we have to decide, did God cause or will God use?
Right.
Yeah.
Because you can make the case because it is Joseph is in prison and that Joseph meets the cupbearer.
Mm-hmm.
It's critical to the flow of the story. So then when you reverse engineer it, you're like, well, what if he doesn't get accused of rape? Now, could God have caused Joseph to run into this cupbearer another way? Absolutely, God could.
Yeah.
So I do think you're right. I think we have to be really careful to say God caused something when we can't know that.
Yeah.
We can absolutely say God redeemed.
Mm-hmm.
Caused this, and I can't say for sure he didn't.
Right.
The question is, what's my motivation? Is it because I don't like what you're doing, something bad happened to you, and I say, see there, God caused that because you weren't doing the right thing? Well, then you point to all these people in the Old Testament that weren't doing the right thing. You're like, did God bless their non-right thing? And the thing is, this is not to create. There are moral standards. There are ways we're to treat our wives, the way we are to treat our business associations, the way we're to treat as though God works with you in every circumstance.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's something that we say, yeah. But we really need to dig into how messy it was for them to contextualize how messy our lives get. And we tell ourselves, God still will work through this just like he worked through that.
Yeah.
And I think that's the very reason he leaves those stories.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, talk to me about, and you may have said what you need to there, but this dynamic of favorites, and you marked it out, the pathway. You have Abraham, and we don't know, did Abraham's dad prefer his brother? Was it easy for
Yeah.
Abraham to leave because his dad was a jerk? We don't know, but the idea that he was, he chose Isaac over Ishmael, and then Isaac chose, Esau over Jacob, and Jacob chose Joseph over the other 11 brothers. Why do you think that is so magnified? Because you said in the thing, Joseph could have easily thought, God, didn't you give me these dreams? Didn't you say I was going to really matter? And
Yeah.
here I am in prison. Like that's easy to see him doing that.
Yeah. So my computer's glitching out again. Tell me again, what was your question? That, because I have a few different ideas running through my head, and I don't know if they fit.
Yeah. So why do you think God, again, God can tell stories any way he wants. He could easily bypass the magnification of these favorite dynamics showing up, favorite son dynamics. And yet he clearly portrays it's favoritism that's causing a lot of this problem.
Mm-hmm.
Jacob created the environment that Joseph would tell these really offensive visions and not fear any consequence.
Yeah.
Jacob created that. So why do you think God brings that to the forefront of these stories?
Man, I don't know why that particular dynamic. I caught myself at the end when I said, Joseph changed generations, but then he takes his two sons to Jacob to be blessed and says, give the bigger blessing to the oldest. And Jacob's like, no, I will give the bigger blessing to the youngest. It's like, why can't you treat them equally? So the point is, he offered grace where it would have been very natural for him to have blown him up. And the story is still messy. Just because he offers grace doesn't mean, and now we will all live happily ever after. Now we step into a fairy tale, because they move right on into more unhealth. God rescues the Israelites from slavery, and right away they take slaves. And God has to step in and say, okay, you have to at least free them every 7 years. And so it feels like there's just these step by step of just what you were talking about, holiness. He's moving us towards something. Man, it is so slow in coming, and we fight him every step of the way.
Yep, absolutely. So kind of, wrapping things up, what do you think is missing from our series? So we have the dynamic of introducing, but God being rich in mercy. Then we have the dynamic of, that's hard to hear. You got to keep remembering this when you have a lot of pain and you're having all these messages that, man, God's not rescuing me. Then you have waiting. So I'm preaching this next Sunday. What do you think is lacking? So if somebody's considering their life, I really want to lean into this dynamic of believing, having the lens that, but God. Where should I start?
Sorry.
But God who is rich. Yeah, it's fine. But God who is rich, and I want to believe that, but God who is rich in mercy is going to take us in the right direction. But I have these realities in my life that would say the opposite. What's lacking, do you think?
Man, I don't know. It could be personal stories. It could be what does that look like in the year 2020, hearing, or 2010? What's a more recent story of but God? The one other thing that comes up is the consistency between Ephesians 2 and Galatians 1. That there's a but God. There's different ways of saying who is rich in mercy, and they both end in purpose. And so I think that would be a natural, like even if it was from another Old Testament story, like Jonah, God was merciful. It didn't look like mercy because it meant he was in a whale for 3 days, but the big fish was God's vehicle of mercy. and it ends in purpose. It ends in it didn't just happen in a vacuum. There's a reason for it. There's a reason for his mercy. And what is the purpose that his mercy gives us?
Right. That's good.
And
That's good. And I good.
well, the thing that jumps out at me is the consistency in Ephesians 2 and Galatians 1. Like there's that,
Right.
it's as if Paul is sticking to an outline, though if you just read one or the other, you wouldn't even necessarily know it was an outline.
Yeah. That is really helpful. Well, I have my marching orders.
There you go.
But I will now be ready for Sunday. So yeah, no, I love that. I love the idea of anticipating the purpose,
Mm-hmm.
even if you don't know what it's going to be, because in the Ephesians passage, it talks about how he's going to show his and how we become sharers of his immeasurable love. And I wonder about that, because it ties into hope ultimately, is that this is going to accomplish something that is eternal, that is powerful, that is impacting. And that's where we start to really get into depression, is when we feel like this is accomplishing nothing.
Yeah.
You know, walk out the fruit of the Spirit, it's when we said, this isn't getting me anywhere.
Yeah.
And we make the decision way too soon. If Joseph had said in prison, it just doesn't add up. How could a good God put a good man, an innocent man, in prison? That just doesn't work. So there must not be a good God.
Mm-hmm.
And my understanding is, from the time he left home at 17 till the time he saw his brothers, it was 25 years past. And I'd have to dig into the scripture of how I know that, but I'm pretty sure that's factual. And so, that's a long, long time to wait to keep trusting in God, that this is going to take a turn and God will be glorified in my life. And then you take John the Baptist story. But you take these stories that end in death, like John the Baptist, and you're like, at what moment did he think this is going to go well for me? Yeah. And then he dies in prison. So,
well, him sending the messengers to Jesus saying, are you the one? Because it doesn't look like it from where I'm sitting.
So. Exactly. Yeah. And that struggle with doubt and just feel, and that must have been this is a guy that was super confident. So to struggle with disbelief, that had to feel terrible.
Yeah.
That's the thing that is, he got his answer, but then he's killed. And that's the thing that is hard.
Yeah.
Because we don't know how God's going to work it out. And it may be after our death, which, we don't like that story.
Yeah.
But it happens in the Bible, including Jesus himself. I mean, he was raised, but after his death, actually after his resurrection, that's where things really took off. So he wasn't physically present to see Peter preach, and he wasn't physically present to see Paul get all these places. Now we understanding he's with God, he sees it, so the parallel's lost. Well, we think the parallel's lost. Who knows what you see after you die? So there you go. Well, thank you, man. Great job on Sunday. And we are having a drive-in service this Sunday. So prayers for me.
Yeah.
I don't know how that's going to be.
Good luck with. Yeah. It freaked me out going from Memorial to East Side because the auditorium looks so different.
Right.
So what is it like to preach to a bunch of headlights?
Yeah. I don't know.
Or does it look like a 4th of July picnic of people out in their camping chairs, but far away?
Right. Will anybody pay attention? This is a good learning experience for me, because and the whole COVID has been a good learning experience of being able to preach to no one and that be okay. Just doing this for the sake of God. because I do recognize that when I preach to people, I do get energy
Yeah.
from their body language. So, you know, if you want to bless your preacher this Sunday, try not sleeping. That actually helps a lot. But
Have people have billboards.
yeah, that's, you know, we're still listening, you know, kind of thing,
Yeah.
because you won't be able to tell past, you know, 3 rows of cars. So anyway, so it'll be interesting. And then who knows if God wills, we'll be back at Eastside at July 5th. And
Right.
so we'll go from there.
Yep.
All righty. Thank you, man.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. I'm going to
All right.
end the
We'll see you.
recording.